As it turns out, on-hit and on-attack effects in League are incredibly consistent with how they interact with basically everything. For a quick test, take this example. A Katarina with PTA, yes I know it's not normal, just bear with me, Ravenous Hydra, Kraken Slayer, Bladed Rune King, and a Static Shiv. Mythic server, rated than Katarina anyways. If she were to press ult in this example against 3 targets, 1. Who would have PTA procs against them? 2. How many Ravenous Hydra procs to go off? 3. How many times the Kraken Slayer proc? 4. Would the second passive of Borg activate, the move speed one, and if so, against 2? And 5. Does Static Shiv's energized ability go off at all? And if it does it activate multiple times? As a quick tip, Katarina's ult does a total of 15 knives to each target in range over the duration, so 45 in total for this one. I'll give you some time to think about over your answer, maybe even leave a comment below what you think. Feel free to like and subscribe while you're at it. Calls to action are all the rave now, right? After go over all the inconsistencies, we'll look at it again and try to make sense of it all, as well as answering all parts of the question. First up, I actually want to go over Yasuo and Yone Q, since that's a pretty good standard for what I mean. Turns out the Wind Brothers took a hint from Hisoka, as their Q has properties of Bubble and Gum. Wait, no, I meant attacks and abilities, sorry. Starting at one target, it actually behaves just like a normal auto attack. Really convenient, actually. What do you mean? No, it doesn't. As it turns out, even just the normal one-hit attack version is inconsistent. For starters, it activates Sheen when you cast it, as in it gives you the Sheen buff to use in the attack. Okay, nothing too surprising, you did a button to the spell, but then we get on to blocking it. Of the 4 types of non-damage shields, such interruptions, dodge, block, blind, spell shield, all of them behave differently. To further illustrate this point, we're going to quickly go into hitting 2 targets instead. When you hit 2 targets, the first takes the normal attack that I mentioned earlier, it gets all the unhit effects and all that jazz. The second target, however, actually takes spell damage, which notably means that any spell effects also proc on them. The energies Yasuo eat your heart out. This also means they don't benefit from lifesteal, but do benefit from spell vamp, which is pretty niche because it's not really a thing that anyone has. But now the spell damage is actually really consistent, and basically works exactly how you think it would. It even works with Navoi's, which is kind of strange from Yasuo, but hey, it works. So the second target would take more damage than the first because of Navoi's spell amp. The confusing part, however, is the attack damage negation, the dodges, things I mentioned earlier. For straight up dodges, which includes Jax E and Nyla W, it actually blocks the entire thing if they hit by either the primary or his secondary target. Okay, so then the presence that spell damage is blocked like an attack. Well, then we get to Teamless Blind and apparently doesn't do anything. It doesn't block the first target, doesn't block the second target, the dart doesn't get paid enough to work on anything that's not a right click. Please ignore the Zeri Q in the corner, she must have been blind and missed or something. If dodges are the designer brandware and blinds are the thrift shop bargain bin pickups of damage negation, apparently Shen's block is the Kohl's clearance sale. Not quite in demand, but not quite unwanted. It actually blocks the damage if the ally inside of the protection bubble is the primary target, but not if they're the secondary target. In other words, blocking the attack part, but not the spell part, which is a strange interaction, but apparently we're all about inconsistency here. Then there is Sivir's Spell Shield, and Nocturne's Spell Shield as well. I can't wait to see what horrifying mess this will be. Actually, it just entirely blocks it. Both portions of the damage, blocked. The knockup, which the other parries didn't negate actually, blocked. That random Instagram bot that tried to DM me after major first post, blocked. Yasuo getting a stack of his third Q, actually not blocked. Apparently as long as it tries its best to hit something, it gains a stack, even has to go through the 9 circles of hell to do so. That's about all for the Wind Bros though. Can you believe it's possibly the most consistent ability we will see today? We'll have a discussion about that later. Now on first glance, you might be thinking something along the lines of, Daisy? Why would Daisy have strange on-hit interactions? Oh, you pure innocent soul. For God knows why, patch 17.11 has turned Daisy into a patchwork monster that would put Frankensteins to shame. The simplest way to show this is just here. Take a look at all the possible interactions Daisy has certain effects. Depending on your knowledge of Ivern, some of these may seem familiar, others completely from left field, but just bear with me for this part. I'll let you take a quick break to look through them all and make some comments below. Look through them all? Good. You might be wondering what exactly those question marks are. Basically, each one represents an effect for the item that it is tied to. So like Bork, for example, the first question mark represents its first passive, Miss Edge, which is the current health on hit damage one. The second question mark being Siphon, which is the third hit, stealing move speed thingy. Much like how my intelligence being Siphon, trying to make sense of all this. For most of the question marks, it's probably straightforward, only notable ones that being that Trinity Force question mark is not Spellblade, that's the question mark in Sheen's box. It's said that it's threefold strike, which is a stacking AD and speed that it gives when you hit things. Mermana's 2 question marks are the on hit part for the first one, and the on spell hit part for the second one. Sometimes it's used to represent lifesteal. Kashusha Shard, which is energized, might seem out of place at first, but I'll explain why after I show the results. Then for the last explaining, Sheen's 2 little SMC Midnight Thunder icons are the mana and health restoration part of the respective items, and do they work with Daisy, like do they give them the Daisy or give them Ivern, right? Icewind and Lishman per wing, so I'm not going to include those, but they basically just work exactly what I think they do. That's nothing crazy. So, starting with Sheen, it actually synergizes perfectly with Daisy. Iceman Gauntlet's AoE works, Sun Reveal works, Ascending Mana Restore works. I actually wrote like the entire Ivern section thinking Sheen was non-attack when it turns actually on hit. So the pacing will feel a bit weird for the upcoming part, but just bear with me. Quick note that basically every on hit and on attack effect that works for Daisy only works on the normal hits. The third hit knockups do not apply those effects, so it's just the little slams are the on hit, on attack effects. The big slams are spell effects. We'll see that later. Grasp works too actually. It heals Ivern, gives him max HP, and an important note that I'll mention later, it gives him the ranged effect of the ability, not the melee version. Ivern obviously being ranged, and Daisy being melee. I wasn't quite sure what it would do if that's ranged. With that, we have both Grasp and Sheen working, which are both on hit effects. So to follow it up, we have both Bork effects, which are actually on hit. The second gives move speed to Ivern and not Daisy, so that's interesting. And I think you've probably gotten the idea of most of them. So moving on to the inconsistencies. Let's compare Rylai's, which is a spell effect, and Mermana, which has an on hit effect and a spell effect. Rylai's works on every single auto attack, both the mini slams and the big Mamba slams, right? However, for Mermana, the on-hit portion only applies on the normal hits, the small slams, and the spell effect only applies on the big slams, like the big bomb knockups, right? Which doesn't really make sense. In theory, it should work on every single hit, the spell effect ones, since the normal hits apply Rylai's, which is not a spell effect. You'd think that maybe it can only apply one of the 2 at a time, but spoiler alert for Gale's section later on, they can actually apply a lot. Like, a lot more than 2. So Mermana just genuinely does not make sense to me. Why does it work that way? Rageblade has both an on-hit effect and an on-attack effect. Do both effects work? Nope, only the on-hit effect works, and the on-attack effect doesn't work at all. Okay, so Energize has both an on-hit effect and an on-attack effect, so only the on-hit effect works and the on-attack effect doesn't? Nope, actually neither work at all. Daisy doesn't generate stacks, the on-attack portion, or consume them, which is the on-hit portion of Energized. Ivan W, an on-hit effect that works when the attacker, which includes other allied champions, is standing in a bush. So as long as Daisy's in the bush, then she gets the extra damage? Nope, it is entirely dependent on if Ivern is in the bush. Daisy can be in or out of the bush, doesn't matter. Phantom Dancer and Lethal Tempo, both on attack effects. You probably know the drill already, but as for why I'm mentioning on attack effects, Kraken Slayer. You didn't know? It's actually an on-hit effect for melee and an on-attack effect for ranged champions. Ivern is a ranged champion. Grasp, as we mentioned earlier, gave him the ranged effect, so Kraken Slayer is an on-attack effect. On-attack effects didn't work, as I mentioned. Does it work with Daisy? Yep. I don't understand Daisy. Oh, also, just for the record, literally none of this Daisy shenanigans is on the wiki, by the way. This is all hand-tested and hand-suffered. The only mention of Daisy having on-hit effects at all on the entire wiki and its interactions is an undocumented patch note at the very bottom of Ivern's page. That's cool. Moving on, for Rageblade, Phantom Dancer, and Lethal Tempo, I actually have a game theory as to why it doesn't work. See, for PD and Lethal Tempo, they stack up after you finish the attack wind up for each champion's attack animation. If you see when it ticks, you'll see how it is delayed. So basically, once you get past the point that you can cancel the attack animation without canceling the auto attack, which is how you orb walk and all that, you get 1 stack, even if projectile took till next Monday to hit a target. This is opposed to the way Sheen works, where the effect is consumed when the attack actually makes contact with the target. Most notable in Ezreal, if you auto attack without Sheen prepared, then immediately Q, your Sheen will be consumed by the auto attack and will not hit the target that you have Q, unless they're the same person, of course. In fact, Ezreal is actually quite interesting to look at for the previous trio too. Whenever you hit a target with Ezreal's Q, the trio, Phantom Dancer, Rageblade, and Lethal Tempo, instantly refresh the duration, but notice a desync between when they stack and when the Q hits. If my previous idea of being reliant on the attack windup is true, what I think is happening is that after the Q hits, Ezreal does a brief phantom attack, which applies all the effects that should have gone off, but this attack doesn't affect you since it doesn't block you from performing any actions. It's basically a no windup instant attack, but doesn't do anything, and finishes the next game tick. So I guess not technically instant, but you know what I mean. We should also explain why the gap seems variable between queues, because based on tick rate of the server, and we actually see a similar effect occur with... Anyways, what were we talking about? Oh, Daisy, right. While I have that theory for the attack trio, I genuinely don't understand Kraken Slayer. The obvious answer is likely it's just hard-coded to function that way, but that answer kind of feels like a cop-out. Also, if that's true, that is incredibly lazy game design by it. The first idea was that maybe it was counting as on-hit effect, since Daisy is considered melee, but notably there's a precedent for a non-champion that can activate Kraken Slayer, so I don't really have a control to test it against, so maybe? I have no way to know for sure. But thinking about the interaction of the other effects, like Sunderer and Grass Peeling Ivern instead of Daisy, not Davy, along with the on-hit damage from Ivern W being reliant on him rather than Daisy, I don't think that's the case. I did the one thing I wish I never had to. I read the wiki. Bring It Down stacks and triggers its effect on hit instead of on attack from basic attacks that do not utilize a projectile. Bug. Effects that trigger on hit effects will stack and trigger Bring It Down normally. Bring It Down doesn't interact with Ginsu's Rageblade's Phantom Hit or Runin's Hurricane's Wind's Fury. I've never noticed much of a nightmare that is to say. I'm sorry. What? So to get this right, for melee champions, Kraken Slayer is an on-hit effect that does not synergize with on-hit effects, which we in the business would like to call an on-attack effect. And if you're ranged, if you don't use the projectile for a basic attack, then it's an on-hit effect. But again, it's an on-hit effect that doesn't work with on-hit effects, so an on-attack effect, which is what it normally is, except it works with non-projectiles. We've gone beyond spaghetti code. This is some gourmet linguini hieroglyphics. Riot. At the very least, though, it was an answer. That just leaves me with Energized being unexplained. But no joke, I genuinely don't understand why it doesn't work. The way Energized stacks is an on-attack effect, so when you hit something with non-attack effect, you get 6 Energized stacks, you need 100 to proc it, the unproc is an on-hit effect. But you can't double stack it with things like Rageblade, because non-attack effect, non-hit effect. So it makes sense that you can't stack Energize with Daisy since she doesn't apply on-attack effects, as we found earlier. But actually consuming the Energized is an on-hit effect, which means Daisy should technically consume Energized to give him the taser. But she has absolutely no synergy with it at all. And the wiki doesn't have any insight as to why this time, so I genuinely don't know, other than the wiki being wrong about consuming it being on hit. Leaving Daisy on a more positive note before I head to Kale, she actually applies Lifesteal too. I couldn't tell you why, but that's kinda cool. Doesn't even have any bug interactions. Interestingly, Kale is surprisingly consistent, actually. Basically every interaction works exactly as you expect, so much so that Mermana actually becomes an item of note on her. If only it gave any attack speed or was useful prior to becoming Mermana. But the amount of procs you can get with it is absolutely no joke. Also, peculiar side note, if you somehow manage to have a Mermana before getting level 6 on Kale, the Mermana will say the melee damage version of Shock, which is the passive, but when you attack with your E, which makes you ranged, it will actually apply the range effect, which does slightly less damage. It's actually consistent since it behaves like a ranged auto for all things, just surprised that it affected spell effects too. However, multi-hit procs, like Phase Rush and Electrocute, will always give you the melee effect on your E, assuming you're not level 6 yet, since that turns you permanent ranged, regardless if you use E or not for any of the hits, which is interesting. Anyways, back to on-hits. Mermaid is actually really cool since Kaylee applies both the spell effect and the on-hit damage to each targeted hits. So with the exploding version level 11, you can hit 10 procs of Mermana, 2 for each champion in one ability. However, it also works with the waves, the passive thingy that you get from stacking it, each of which also applies a proc to the spell effect, for a total of 15 Mermaid procs with one ability. because you can actually add 2 more on hit procs with Ruinous Hurricane for a grand total of 17 hits of Rare Mana in one ability. Assuming you have the Fire Waves actives and you manage to hit all 5 enemy champions, and no, I'm not going to count clones because that's even more. Anyways, moving on to Ravenous Hydra, it's actually pretty boring. It just procs on every person hit with the E. It doesn't double proc like I had hoped, since it applies both on hit and spell effects. If Ravenous has both a on hit and spell effect part like Rare Mana, so it's just kind of bland. Eclipse also doesn't instantly proc the shield, one for the on hit, one for the spell. It's a rare L for lethality KO players everywhere really. On the runes, there's some interesting stuff here actually, starting off Lethal Tempo. Part of me kinda hoped that hitting multiple targets with the E would give you multiple stacks, but that admittedly would be pretty inconsistent, so it just gives you 1 stack for tempo regardless of the number of enemies hit. PTA though, I don't quite understand. Normally, autoing 1 champion, then autoing another will remove the stacks from the initial target, and the new champion will be at 1. However, for Kale, and keep in mind that it applies on hit effects to all targets, and PTA is an on hit effect, the level 11 E always applies the 1 stack to the main target champion regardless of how many champions are hit. But shouldn't it technically apply it to the last target it applies on hit effects for? Unless it always does the primary target last, but then if you already have 1 stack in the primary, shouldn't it start again at 1 since each other target would then reset it before going back to the main target? I'm not really sure, but it's nothing egregiously inconsistent, so it gets a pass. Now... oh god, this has broken me. Okay, so you're probably wondering what all the Conqueror stuff is about. As it turns out, Conqueror is about as inconsistent as my desire to do anything in life. It changes about every 15 seconds. Basically, every ability that would have questionable interactions with Conqueror is hard-coded to work in a separate way from any other interaction that is similar to it. They're all unique. So much so that after writing the script, I kind of decided that the way to do this abomination justice would be to make it on video in a future time. So, look forward to that. But for now, stick with the Conqueror, because it's a recurring trend of just being pain. So, Katarina Ultimate. We can finally get the answer to those burning questions you have surely had this entire time. 1. You would have PTA proc against them. 2. How many Ravenous Hydra procs go off? 3. How many times did Kraken Slayer proc? 4. Would the second passive of Bork, the Siphon part, activate? And if so, against who? And number 5. Does Static Shiv's energized ability go off at all? And if it does, how many times? Starting from the top, who would have PTA proc against them? If your answer was none of them, congratulations, that's actually right. Also, I wonder how you guessed that, considering that it makes no sense, but good job, I'm proud of you. Yeah, no, I have no idea why I applies to none of them. The effect is on hit, and Katarina should apply on hit effects 15 times, and as with Kale, it seems that abilities that apply on hit effects still work across the attack. The only possible answer I can think of is that maybe since it's not targeted like Kale's E is, like it doesn't have a primary target, but normally that means it just defaults to the closest target, but I guess the roll doesn't? Okay, next question. Ravenous Hydra, how many total procs? And keep in mind it's 15 daggers each to 3 targets. If your answer was 3, since it specifies you can only proc once every 10 seconds on the same ability cast, you'd be wrong actually. It is instead the answer you likely gave of 45, for 15 on 3 targets each. I want to come back to this later, so I won't go too into it now, but know that this confuses me when I rant about it again later. On to Kraken Slayer. This one is kinda boring and straightforward, and you probably guessed it's 15 procs, but now for a more interesting part, if you start with 0 stacks in your ulti, who will it hit? Now the obvious answer would be the furthest target since it applies on the first 2, but I raise a question that since they hit at the same time, what if it's actually random? Well, it's not, yeah, it's just the furthest target. It is kinda cool that it changes based on how many stacks start with though, with 1 stack being the middle target and 2 stacks being the closest target instead, because it would proc on that initial hit, and then it would stack 2 more on the further ones, and yeah, it's cool. It's interesting actually. For another free one, the first passive of Bork. Yeah, it works exactly as you expect, but the second part of Bork, which clarifies attacking, would that activate? And keep in mind PTA, which was an on-hit effect based on hitting the same enemy 3 times, would it work? Well, the answer is yes, actually. It does work, and for bonus points, it activates against the closest target. Yeah. I don't know why it works differently than PTA, but it does, so that's cool. Energized, while maybe not the most normal thing to build, actually does work with Katarina. In fact, I could even see Static being a potential option for it if it wasn't for the fact that it suffers the same damage reduction as other on-hit effects. So it ends up really not doing enough damage to justify building it. It does also stack on each twirl, which we'll get to later, and it even stacks faster when targets hit with it. So 3 champions give you 2 to 3 energized procs, which would be quite strong, and then you come back to the damage on it. Now, I want to take a quick pit stop at Phantom Dancer and Lethal Tempo. Both of them are on-attack effects that stack. I know it wasn't part of the original prompt, but one final question for you. If she altered in that same position with those 2 items, would they stack? And if it does, how many times would she have to spin, as in throw a knife at all 3 targets to stack it? Well, I asked since it does actually stack, that's the answer to that one. And my immediate thought was that it was once per spin, since there was the whole Lethal Tempo is tied to attack animation thing I mentioned earlier, but it's actually each individual knife, meaning it's 2 total spins against 3 targets for tempo, and then obviously 1 1/3 spin against 3 targets for PD, since it's 4 stacks total. Which leads me to my confusion in how on-attack effects work. I do kind of have a working theory, which Ravenous Hydra builds on, so here you see a obligatory callback to how I mentioned Ravenous Hydra earlier. What I believe is happening is essentially that every time Katarina spins, she triggers 1 attack instance. Now, what is an attack instance, you might be asking? Good question. I would be replying, basically it's the forbidden no jutsu of attacks that it's like never explicitly mentioned, but is the actual name for all effects that activate when you auto-attack, and describes all the rules and interactions for any resulting hits. Now, you might think that's an on-attack effect, and it kind of is, but there's some separate exceptions to them, so I'll get to that. Notably, this is different from the actual attack, which would be the projectile for ranged characters, or the impact, quote-unquote, from melee characters. Ravenous Hydra can affect each target once per attack/cast instance. Energized stacks once per target per attack instance, if that makes sense. Faithmancer and Lethal Tempo are not triggered from the attack instance, but instead by the resulting attack. That's the difference I mentioned earlier. So from this perspective, every spin from Katarina is 1 attack instance. This attack instance then launches an attack that hits up to 3 nearby enemy champions. So it's 3 attacks, but 1 attack instance, if that makes sense. The attacks are all bound to the same attack instance, so it doesn't trigger the 10-second lockout of Ravenous Hydra, because they're all simultaneously hitting, but not slightly delayed, but basically simultaneous. However, since they're individual attacks, each one applies their on-attack and on-hit effects individually, letting them each stack as if you had actually launched up to 3 attacks, but you only did 1. Now, do we have any actual proof that this is happening? Absolutely not. This is just an educated guess, and it's most of the inconsistencies I have noticed. However, you may notice a certain precision keystone-shaped hole in this theory. Conquer. Okay, Conquer as well. Again, that gets us on video. Press the attack. Yeah. Under my understanding, what would actually happen is the first attack launches and would hit the first target, applying 1 stack of PTA. The second attack would hit the second target and transfer the PTA because you've hit a new target. Then, when the third dagger hits the final target, it would transfer the single stack to that target. Then repeat again from each spin. But obviously it's not what happens, so it doesn't quite work. The only possible answer I can think of is that the way PTA will actually work is that it's tied to both attack instance and an attack, which is a whole other can of worms. Instead of the attack applying PTA or the attack instance, what if the way it actually worked was that each attack instance is able to both apply PTA to the first target hit and remove PTA if it wasn't the previously hit target, but any subsequent attacks could only remove previous stacks. Essentially, application would be tied to cast instance or attack instance, but removal would be tied to the attack itself. This would also explain why it is Katarina that is the only one to have this type of interaction, aside from Infernum Aphelios, but like I've ranted long enough, so I don't want to go over that one too. He's a whole other can of worms that we don't have time for today. This would actually be a perfect explanation of why, aside from 2 issues. Firstly, if you only hit 1 target with Cat ulti, it should apply PTA using this logic, since there's no secondary targets to remove the PTA. However, it doesn't work at all. Secondly, if you had hit someone with an auto attack applied to them with PTA, Katarina ulti doesn't move it under any circumstances, which it should be repeatedly applying and then moving. Katarina ulti just doesn't interact with PTA at all. It's weird. And this is about where I truly give up in trying to explain it. My only answer is that it's just hard-coded to work that way, especially since I feel this is Infernum Q, where it's completely different from Katarina ulti. Also, Conqueror pokes a massive hole in the method as well, but I'll get to that in the future. And now we reach the end. Well, the end for now at least. There are a bunch of other weird things that I haven't investigated yet, and like half the interactions I still don't really understand how they work. Energized. So I'll probably revisit this in the future, but what can we do to try and fix this? Well, first off, the word attacking should be consistent. I've cut it out from the video because it just kind of derailed it a bit too much. But for Bork, attacking means an on-hit effect. For Phantomancer, attacking means an on-attack effect. Why aren't they the same? I don't know. I don't know why they're different. Why don't we just have them be the same? Whatever. Also, in the shop, there are on-hit effects, which are specially marked. But there's no on-attack effects marked, even though they exist. Most notably, PD is the main one. And I don't get why. Also, like, most champions don't mention on-attack. There's a few, like Katarina ulti. Most of the, like, multi-hits, Katarina ulti, Belbuff E, and Akshan E are the ones that come to mind, mention on-attack, but a lot of hits don't mention the on-attack effects existing at all, which is weird, but yeah. Sorry, I ended up derailing anyways. Basically, what I mean is just make attack be consistent, and also just add an on-attack like icon in shop, just like we have on hit. I don't know why it's not both. There should be both. That's all for that thing. Secondly, what is going on with Kraken Slayer, and who let Schrodinger cook, man? It's a conditional on-attack effect that is conditionally also an on-hit effect for certain abilities unless you're melee, in which case it's always on-hit, but it doesn't interact with on-hit effects like Ginsu's or Runins, so it mostly behaves like an on-attack effect regardless of your range type. I get a headache just saying that. Can we just make it on-hit for everyone all the time? For range champions, most abilities that apply on-hit effects are hard-coded to proc Kraken anyways, so it really doesn't actually change anything. Thirdly, if you've noticed in the shop, some of the on-hit effect items have the little on-hit label in different colored text with the little icon next to it, which is actually pretty nice. But the issue is they only labeled it on like half of them, and it's the more obvious ones, things like Nash's Tooth and Wit's End, where it's like kind of obvious. They don't label it on the more obscure ones, like Threefold Strike and Trinity Force. But if you select the on-hit effect label on the left side of the shop, it does come up. Also, Sheen comes up, so maybe it's for Sheen and it just happens to also work for Threefold Strike. I don't really know. Either way, Sheen also does, actually Sheen does have it labeled, I'm pretty sure. But then the other ones don't, like Trinity Force, Weaver, Ice Gauntlet, and Divine Thunder. And Lichbane, I think for that matter. Lichbane might have a label as well, actually. But yeah, they don't. What, they like gave up on labeling the on-hit effects like halfway through? Why? I don't know. But yeah, it's weird. Just finish labeling them correctly, I guess. I'm not quite sure how to end this now, since I've kind of ranted. So I asked ChatGPT to write some jokes for me, given the script. Admittedly, most of them don't make sense, and for some reason it really thought Katarina had bouncing daggers in her ulti, but they're actually kind of unintentionally funny, which is the best kind of comedy. So I'm just going to read them to you, and we can end the video there. So, if you manage to land all 15 daggers on a single Teemo, not only does it explode into mushroom field, but the League client crashes and you find yourself questioning life choices. Yeah, this one just kind of made me feel called out. Also, this is the whole bouncing daggers bit where it, for some reason, it thought that the daggers themselves just had like a chance of not hitting the enemy. I don't know why, which actually kind of feels like a fantastic change to Katarina, you know, make them a little more balanced. Trying to predict these interactions is like trying to predict the weather in a chaotic dimension where the forecast is constantly changing and it's always raining skill shots, which honestly isn't particularly funny, but for the rest of them, it would label the jokes with like a title explaining like the idea of the joke. This one was just labeled Gamer's Dilemma, which is now how I'm going to refer to every problem in my life. And finally, to wrap it all up, a little inspiration for all of us. Why did the League of Legends player break up with the game? Because they finally realized uninstalling their problems was easier than uninstalling League. That's all. Have a good rest of your day, night, or anywhere in between.